The desert wind howled through Redemption Creek like a wounded animal, carrying with it the taste of alkali dust and broken promises. It was a merciless October evening in 1887, and the small Wyoming town huddled against the approaching storm like a sinner before judgment. Wooden buildings, their paint long ago surrendered to the elements, creaked and groaned under the assault. Above it all, perched on the hill like a weathered sentinel, stood the simple white church, its cross tilting slightly eastward, as if even God himself was considering abandoning this forsaken place. Grace Morrison stood at the kitchen window of the parsonage, her slender fingers wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. At 28, she still possessed the kind of beauty that made men remove their hats in the street, though years of prairie sun had etched fine lines around her green eyes. Her auburn hair, pinned severely beneath a modest bonnet, caught the last rays of dying sunlight. To the good people of Redemption Creek, she was the perfect minister's wife. Pious, dutiful, above reproach, they saw her pressed calico dresses, her downcast eyes during Sunday service, her gentle hands distributing bread to the poor. They did not see the woman who lay awake at night, counting the boards in the ceiling while her husband snored beside her. They did not know about the dreams that haunted her, dreams of wildflowers and freedom, of a life unbound by scripture and propriety. Most of all, they did not know about the Colt .45 hidden beneath her pillow, its cold metal a comfort against the suffocating weight of righteousness. Grace. The voice cut through her reverie like a blade. Reverend Elijah Morrison stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light. At 45, he was still what the townswomen called a fine figure of a man, with his steel-gray hair and stern jaw, but Grace knew better. She knew the ice that lived behind those pale blue eyes, the way his large hands could grip a Bible with the same force they gripped her wrists when she displeased him. "Supper should have been ready 20 minutes ago," he said, his tone as measured as his Sunday sermons. "The Lord's work requires punctuality in all things." "Yes, Elijah." The words came automatically, worn smooth by repetition. "The stew is nearly done." He studied her for a long moment, and she forced herself to remain still under his scrutiny. Finally, he nodded. "I'll be in my study. The sermon for Sunday requires contemplation. This week's theme is the wages of sin." His lips curved in what might have been a smile on another man's face. "The congregation needs reminding that temptation lurks in every shadow." When his footsteps faded down the hall, Grace allowed herself a single, shuddering breath. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. Sparse at first, then building to a steady drumbeat against the windows. Lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating the barren landscape in brief, violent flashes. She was ladling stew into bowls when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A heavy thud against the woodshed door, followed by what might have been a groan. Grace froze, ladle suspended in midair. The sound came again, more distinct this time. Human, desperate. Every instinct screamed at her to fetch Elijah, to let him handle whatever trouble had blown in with the storm. But something else, something deeper and older than fear, moved her feet toward the back door. She grabbed the lantern from its hook, her free hand brushing against her apron pocket where she kept a small knife for kitchen work. The rain hit her like a baptism of ice, soaking through her dress in seconds. She stumbled across the muddy yard, lantern swinging wildly, until she reached the woodshed. There, collapsed against the door like a broken scarecrow, was a man. Even in the dim light, she could see the dark stain spreading across his shirt, mixing with the rain to form pink rivulets in the mud. His face was turned away, but she could make out dark hair plastered to his skull, broad shoulders that spoke of hard labor or harder living. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster empty. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She should scream, should run, should do anything but what she did next. Instead, she knelt beside him, setting the lantern on the ground. Her fingers found his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, thready but stubborn. The man's head rolled toward her, and in the flickering light, their eyes met, even glazed with pain. They were the color of whiskey in firelight, amber and dangerous. Something stirred in Grace's memory. A fragment of another night, another pair of eyes. But the thought scattered as he tried to speak. "Please!" The word was barely a whisper. "Just need shelter. Won't hurt anyone." She should have left him there. Should have let the storm and the cold finish what bullet or blade had started. That's what Elijah would say. What any righteous woman would do. But Grace Morrison had long ago learned that righteousness and right were not always the same thing. "Can you stand?" She kept her voice low, glancing back at the house. No movement from Elijah's study window. "Good." The stranger nodded, though the effort clearly cost him. Together, they managed to get him to his feet. Grace bearing more of his weight than she'd thought possible. He smelled of leather and gunpowder, blood and rain. They stumbled through the shed door, and she guided him to the corner behind the stacked cordwood, where old horse blankets made a rough bed. He collapsed onto them with a grunt, and in the better light of the shed, she could see the wound clearly, a deep gash running from his left shoulder down toward his ribs. Knife work, not a bullet, the kind of wound that came from fighting close and personal. "I need to stop the bleeding," she heard herself say. "Don't move." She ran back to the house, mind racing. Bandages from the linen closet, the bottle of whiskey Elijah kept for medicinal purposes, clean water. Her hands moved with the efficiency that surprised her, as if they'd been waiting for this moment, for something that mattered. When she returned, the stranger had managed to shrug off his vest and shirt in the lantern light. His torso was a map of violence, old scars crossing newer ones. The story of a hard life written in flesh, but it was the wound that held her attention, angry and deep. "This is going to hurt," she warned, uncorking the whiskey. "Can't hurt worse than—" His words cut off in a hiss as she poured the alcohol over the gash. His body went rigid, hands fisting in the blankets, but he didn't cry out. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best she could, then binding it tight with strips of clean linen. "You're running from someone," she said. It wasn't a question. He studied her face, seemed to weigh his words. "Bounty hunters, maybe the law. Hard to tell the difference anymore." "Did you do what they say?" A bitter smile touched his lips. "Does it matter? Man like me, guilt's assumed. Been running so long. Sometimes I forget what started it." She sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of how close they were, how improper this all was. "I should get you some water, food." "Why?" The question was soft, genuinely curious. "Why help me?" Grace looked at him, really looked at him. Beneath the grime and blood, he had the kind of face that had once been handsome before the world got its hooks in. Strong jaw, stubbled with several days' growth, a scar through his left eyebrow. And those eyes? Lord help her. Those eyes that seemed to see right through her careful facade. "Because," she said finally, "I know what it's like to be trapped." Something flickered in his expression, a recognition that went beyond words. He reached out, his calloused fingers barely brushing her hand where it rested on her knee. The touch was light as butterfly wings, but it sent lightning through her veins. "Thank you," he said simply. She pulled her hand back as if burned, standing abruptly. "I'll bring food, and you can stay until dawn. The storm should break by then." As she turned to go, he spoke again. "Name's Caleb. Caleb Hayes." She paused at the door, not turning back. "Grace," she said softly. "Grace Morrison." Behind her, she heard him whisper something that might have been, "I know." But the wind snatched the words away before she could be sure. She fled back to the house, heart pounding, telling herself it was just the danger, just the storm. But as she stood in the kitchen, hands shaking as she filled a plate with stew and bread, fragments of memory began to surface. A mining camp called Red Gulch, smoke and whiskey and rough laughter, men with hands that grabbed and held too tight. And then, a stranger with amber eyes, quick as lightning with his gun, leaving 3 men dead in the dust while she ran into the night. The plate nearly slipped from her nerveless fingers. It couldn't be. That was 5 years ago. A lifetime ago. Before she'd buried that girl under layers of propriety and prayer. Before she'd married Elijah in a desperate bid for respectability, for safety, for redemption from her mother's sins. But she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that the man bleeding in her woodshed was the same one who'd saved her that night in Red Gulch. The question was, did he remember her? And more importantly, what would she do if he did? The storm raged on. And somewhere in the house, Elijah's footsteps moved from study to bedroom. Soon he would expect her to join him, to lie still and dutiful while he exercised his husbandly rights with the same passion he brought to his sermons, which was to say, none at all. But tonight, Grace Morrison had a choice to make. In the morning, she could send the stranger on his way, return to her life of quiet desperation, or she could finally admit that some cages, no matter how gilded with scripture and propriety, were still prisons. Her hand found the hidden pocket in her skirts, where the key to the root cellar beneath the woodshed rested. It was deeper than Elijah knew. That cellar, deep enough to hide a man, if necessary. Deep enough to buy time while she decided whether saving Caleb Hayes might also mean saving herself. The rain hammered against the windows like fists, and Grace made her choice. She gathered the supplies, food, water, another lantern, more bandages, and slipped back out into the storm. Whatever morning brought, whatever price she might pay, she would not let him die. Not the man who'd given her a second chance at life, even if she'd wasted it on this pale imitation of living. Not tonight. The first thing Caleb Hayes became aware of was warmth, not the burning fever of infection, but the gentle heat of wool blankets and shelter from the storm. The second was the woman sitting beside him, her face illuminated by lamplight as she wrung water from a cloth. His hand moved instinctively to where his gun should be, finding only empty air. The movement sent fire through his shoulder, and he couldn't suppress a grunt of pain. Easy. Her voice was soft, cultured but with an undertone of something else, prairie dust and hidden strength. You're safe. For now. Safe. The word almost made him laugh. He hadn't been safe since the day he'd shot Jake Thornton in that saloon in Cheyenne. Self-defense. Not that anyone cared about such distinctions when Thornton's wealthy father put $1,000 on your head. My gun. Hidden. She didn't look at him as she placed the cool cloth on his forehead. Along with your horse. Found him tied behind the church. He's in the old stable now. The one nobody uses. Smart. Caleb studied her as she worked, trying to reconcile this proper minister's wife with the girl from Red Gulch. The hair was different, tamed and pinned instead of wild and free. The dress was modest gray wool instead of faded calico. But the eyes, those green eyes held depths that no amount of prayer could fill. How long was I out? 2 hours, maybe 3. She sat back, and he noticed the tremor in her hands. The wound is deep. You've lost blood. He tried to sit up, gritting his teeth against the pain. I need to go. If they tracked me this far, in this storm, not even Satan himself could follow tracks in this. She pressed a firm hand against his chest, easing him back down. The touch burned through his undershirt. You'll tear the wound open. Then you'll be no good to anyone, least of all yourself. There was sense in what she said, but sense had never been Caleb's strong suit. Still, the warmth of the shed, the softness of her voice, the bone-deep exhaustion, they all conspired to keep him still. Why? He asked, echoing his earlier question. Your husband finds me here. It won't go well for either of us. Something flickered across her face. Fear, maybe, or something darker. Elijah is occupied. His sermon requires divine inspiration, which generally takes him until midnight. The bitter twist to her words said volumes about her marriage. Still doesn't explain why you'd risk it. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers smoothing the blanket unnecessarily. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Do you remember a place called Red Gulch, 5 years ago? The memory hit him like a physical blow, a mining camp, rough and lawless. 3 men cornering a young woman behind the assay office, her screams cutting through the night. He'd been passing through, wanted to mind his own business, but something about the terror in her voice. "The girl," he breathed. "You were the girl." She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Grace Daniels, then. My mother had just died. I'd gone to the camp looking for work, any kind of work that wasn't—" She trailed off, but he could fill in the blanks. "Those men, they thought because of who my mother was, what she did, that I would be the same." They were wrong. It wasn't a question. He remembered the fight in her, even terrified as she was. "You killed them." Her voice was flat, matter of fact. 3 shots. 3 men. Then you told me to run and never look back. And you did. I ran. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Ran straight into the arms of the first respectable man who'd have me. Elijah was doing temperance lectures in the territories then. He saw a fallen woman in need of salvation. Her hands clenched in her lap. I saw a way to become someone else, someone clean. Caleb studied her face in the lamplight, seeing now what he'd been too rushed to see that night in Red Gulch, the delicate bone structure, the determined chin, the eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "You weren't fallen," he said quietly. "Just lost." "Is there a difference?" She stood abruptly, busying herself with the supplies she'd brought. "I've brought food, beef stew, bread. You need to eat. Keep your strength up." He accepted the plate gratefully, suddenly aware of the hollow ache in his stomach. The first spoonful of stew nearly made him moan. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten anything that hadn't been trail rations or saloon fare. "This is good," he said between bites. "Really good. One of my few accomplishments." She settled back beside him, maintaining a careful distance. "Elijah says my cooking is the only thing that makes me worth keeping." The casual cruelty of it made Caleb's jaw clench. "He doesn't deserve you." "Deserve?" She shook her head. "Out here, it's not about deserving. It's about surviving. You should know that better than most." He couldn't argue with that. They sat in companionable silence while he ate. The storm still raging outside. The shed was a small island of warmth and light in the darkness, and Caleb found himself wishing he could stay in this moment, dangerous as it was. "Tell me," Grace said suddenly. "What happened? Why are they hunting you?" He set the empty plate aside, considering how much to tell her, but she'd earned the truth with her trust. "Started in Cheyenne 3 years back. Jake Thornton, son of a railroad baron, took a disliking to me. Something about the way I looked at his woman." He snorted. "Truth was, she'd been making eyes at me for weeks. I wanted no part of it, but Jake didn't see it that way." "He called you out?" "In front of half the town. I tried to walk away, but—" He shrugged, then winced as it pulled at his wound. "Men like that don't let you walk away." He drew first. Plenty of witnesses saw it. "But his daddy owns those witnesses now." "So you ran?" "Been running ever since. Turned bounty hunter for a while. Figured if I was going to live outside the law, might as well get paid for it. But that went bad too. Partners sold me out for a bigger score." Grace reached for the whiskey bottle, poured a measure into a tin cup. "Here. For the pain." He accepted it gratefully. The burn of the alcohol a familiar comfort. "What about you? How does someone go from Red Gulch to—" He gestured vaguely at her proper dress, her pinned hair. "I told you, I ran into salvation." The word dripped with irony. "Elijah found me in Laramie, half-starved and sleeping in doorways. He offered me food, shelter, respectability. All I had to do was renounce my past, accept his version of God's love, and become the perfect minister's wife. And you did. I did." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "For 5 years, I've played the part, never missed a Sunday service, never spoke out of turn, never gave anyone reason to suspect that the minister's wife was born in a crib above a saloon." The pain in her voice was raw, fresh, like a wound that had never properly healed. Without thinking, Caleb reached out, his rough hand covering hers where it lay on the blanket between them. She went very still, but didn't pull away. "You survived," he said softly. "No shame in that." "Survived?" She turned her hand palm up, her fingers tentatively intertwining with his. Is that what this is? Because most days, it feels more like a slow death. He squeezed her hand gently, understanding all too well. I know the feeling. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, or just two people who'd been alone too long finding a moment of connection. I should go, she whispered, but made no move to stand. Storm still raging. It'll blow itself out by morning. You should be able to ride out then. Grace. Her name felt like a prayer on his lips. What if I don't want to go? Her breath caught, and he could see the war playing out behind her eyes, duty against desire, safety against freedom. You have to. Staying means death for you and worse for me. Worse. You've never seen Elijah truly angry. Her voice was barely audible. He hides it well, but there's something cold inside him, something that enjoys the fire and brimstone sermons a little too much. Caleb's free hand moved to her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. Come with me. The words hung in the air between them. Impossible and inevitable. She leaned into his touch for just a moment before pulling back. I can't. Where would we go? How would we live? And the scandal, they'd hunt us both. Let them hunt. I've been running for 3 years. I can keep running. But with you... He struggled to find words for what he was feeling. With you, it might be worth it. She stood abruptly, breaking the contact between them. You're delirious. Loss of blood and whiskey. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. He caught her hand as she turned to go. I've thought about you. That night in Red Gulch, wondered what happened to the girl with fire in her eyes. That girl is dead. But her voice shook. No, he said softly. She's just been sleeping. I can see her, right there behind the minister's wife mask. Grace pulled her hand free, but gently. Even if that were true, some things can't be undone. I made my choice. Choices can be remade. She looked down at him, and he could see the tears she was fighting. Get some rest. I'll check your wound again before dawn. She gathered the dishes and turned to go, but paused at the door. Caleb, thank you, for Red Gulch. I never got to say it then. You just did. She slipped out into the storm, leaving him alone with the lamplight and his thoughts. The wind howled through the gaps in the shed walls, and Caleb closed his eyes, trying not to think about how empty the space felt without her in it. Somewhere in the darkness, a door slammed. Footsteps crossed the yard, too heavy to be Grace's. Caleb's hand moved instinctively to where his gun should be, finding only empty air. He held his breath, listening. But the footsteps moved past the shed toward the house. The minister, checking on his domain, making sure all was as it should be in his tidy little kingdom. Caleb wondered what the good reverend would think if he knew his wife was nursing a wanted man in the shed. What he would do to Grace if he found out. The thought sent a surge of protective anger through him. He'd saved her once from men who wanted to hurt her. Could he do it again, wounded as he was? And more importantly, would she let him? The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, and Caleb settled back against the blankets, trying to find a position that didn't send fire through his shoulder. Dawn would come too soon, bringing with it decisions that couldn't be unmade, but for now, he held on to the memory of her hand in his, the whisper of his name on her lips, and the wild hope that maybe, just maybe, two broken souls could find wholeness together, even if it meant running forever, even if it meant leaving everything behind. Some things, some people, were worth any price. And Grace Morrison, née Daniels, the girl from Red Gulch with sorrow in her eyes and steel in her spine, was worth it all. The storm refused to break, hour after hour. The wind howled its fury across the plains, turning the world into a maelstrom of water and darkness. Grace stood at the kitchen window, watching the shed through the rain-blurred glass. Her hands mechanically dried the same plate over and over, her mind elsewhere, with the wounded man who'd stumbled back into her life carrying memories she'd tried so hard to bury. "Still at your chores?" Elijah's voice made her jump. He stood in the doorway, nightshirt pristine, hair still perfectly combed despite the late hour. "The virtuous woman worketh willingly with her hands, though perhaps not at midnight." "I couldn't sleep." She set the plate down carefully, willing her hands not to tremble. "The storm. Ah, yes, God's reminder of our insignificance." He moved into the kitchen, and she forced herself not to step back. Though some might say storms are his way of washing the world clean of sin. There was something in his tone that made her skin crawl. Had he heard something, seen something? But his pale eyes gave nothing away as they studied her. "You seem troubled." "Wife." "Just the weather. It reminds me of—" She caught herself before mentioning her past. Elijah preferred to pretend she'd sprung into existence the day he'd found her in Laramie. "Of what?" His voice sharpened. "Of how fortunate I am to have a solid roof over my head." The lie came smoothly, practiced. "Not everyone is so blessed tonight." He studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "Indeed, the righteous are sheltered while the wicked suffer the storm, as it should be." He turned to go, then paused. "I'll be returning to my study. This tempest has given me inspiration for Sunday's sermon. The wages of sin. Grace. Always the wages of sin." She waited until his footsteps faded before allowing herself to breathe. The clock on the mantel chimed once. 1 o'clock. Dawn was still hours away. But she couldn't wait any longer. She had to know Caleb was all right, had to convince him to leave before Elijah discovered him. The journey across the yard was treacherous, wind-driven rain hitting her like tiny stones. She slipped twice in the mud before reaching the shed, her dress soaked through, hair escaping its pins in wet tendrils. Caleb was awake, sitting up despite her earlier warnings. In the lamplight, she could see the sheen of sweat on his forehead. Fever, probably, though his eyes were clear and alert. "You shouldn't be here," he said as she entered. "You shouldn't be sitting up." She knelt beside him, checking the bandages. A few spots of blood, but the bleeding had mostly stopped. "You'll tear the stitches." Heard footsteps earlier. "Your husband." "Yes, but he's back in his study now." She found the cloth, wet it from the water bucket. "You're burning up." "I've had worse." But he didn't protest as she bathed his face and neck with the cool water. "Grace, we need to talk about what happens when this storm breaks. You leave. You get as far from here as possible." "That's not what I meant." She busied herself checking his wound, refusing to meet his eyes. "It's the only thing that can happen." "Is it?" His hand caught her wrist, stilling her movements. "Look at me." She did, reluctantly, and immediately wished she hadn't. Those amber eyes held too much, understanding, desire, and something else that might have been hope. "Do you remember what you said earlier?" he asked softly. "About this being a slow death?" "I was being dramatic. The loss of blood, the storm, it affected me." "Liar." But he said it gently, like an endearment. "I've been running for 3 years. Grace, living in shadows, trusting no one. Always looking over my shoulder. That's a slow death, too. At least you're free." "Am I?" He released her wrist, but caught her hand instead, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "What good is freedom if you're always alone? If you can never stop moving long enough to build something real? And what would we build, Caleb? A life on the run? Always wondering when they'll catch up? When someone will recognize you from a wanted poster? Maybe. Or maybe we find somewhere they'd never think to look. Mexico, California, hell, even Canada. Somewhere we could start over." The picture he painted was seductive. A new life, a new name, free from the weight of expectations and lies. But fairy tales were for children, and Grace had learned long ago that life rarely offered happy endings. "I have nothing," she said quietly. "No money, no skills besides keeping house and cooking. I'd be a burden." "You could never be a burden." His voice was fierce. "And you're wrong about having nothing. You have courage. I saw it that night in Red Gulch, and I see it now." "You have kindness." You saved a stranger tonight when it could cost you everything. And you have strength. Good God, Grace. The strength it must take to wear that mask every day. Stop. The word came out as a sob. Please, just stop. But he continued, relentless as the storm. How long are you going to pay for your mother's sins? How long are you going to let that cold bastard punish you for being human? He saved me. He trapped you. There's a difference. Caleb struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring the pain it clearly caused him. I've met men like him before. They don't save people out of kindness. They do it for control, for the pleasure of keeping something beautiful in a cage. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. How many times had Elijah reminded her of what she owed him? How many sermons about grateful wives and fallen women had been aimed at her? Even if you're right, she whispered. I made vows. Before God, the God I believe in wouldn't want this for you. Wouldn't want you dying inside, piece by piece. She pulled her hand free, standing abruptly. You don't understand. My mother, she was a prostitute. Everyone knew it. When she died, they found her in an alley, beaten to death by some customer who thought he'd paid for more than she was willing to give. The words poured out. Years of shame and fear given voice. I was 15, alone. Do you know what happens to girls like that? The daughter of a whore with no money, no family? I can guess. No, you can't. She paced the small space, unable to keep still. Because you're a man. You can run, you can fight, you can make your own way. But women like me, we have two choices. Follow our mothers into the trade or find a respectable man to take us in. I chose respectability. I chose safety. You chose a different kind of prison. She whirled on him. At least I'm alive. At least I'm not dying in some crib above a saloon, wondering which customer will be the one to... She broke off, choking on the words. Caleb was on his feet before she could protest, swaying slightly but determined. His hands found her shoulders, gentle but firm. Grace, look at me. She did, tears streaming down her face. You're not your mother. You never were. And staying with a man who makes you feel like you are, that's not safety. That's just a slower kind of dying. I'm afraid, she admitted, the words barely audible. I'm so afraid. I know. He pulled her against him, careful of his wounded shoulder. So am I, but maybe together. We don't have to be. She should have pulled away. Should have remembered propriety, duty, the danger of being discovered. Instead, she let herself be held, let herself feel the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart despite everything he'd been through. Tell me about your life, she said against his chest. Before all this? Who were you? He was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking her still damp hair. Son of a school teacher and a cavalry officer. Grew up in Missouri, before the war tore everything apart. Learned to shoot from my father, to read from my mother. Thought I'd be a lawman once. Had a badge and everything in a little town called Cedar Ridge. What happened? War came. Father died at Shiloh. Mother followed 6 months later. Broken heart. The doctor said, after that. He shrugged. Tried to go back to being a lawman, but the world had changed. Or maybe I had ended up drifting, taking work where I could find it. Ranch hand, cavalry scout, even rode shotgun for Wells Fargo for a while. You had a real life once. There was wonder in her voice. A normal life. So did you, before your mother's choices defined you. He pulled back enough to see her face. We both got dealt bad hands, Grace, but that doesn't mean the game's over. Elijah would come after us. He'd never let the scandal stand, his wife running off with an outlaw. He'd make it his mission to see us both destroyed. Let him try. There was steel in Caleb's voice now. I've faced worse than a self-righteous preacher. Have you? She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. He's not just a minister. Caleb, he has connections, powerful friends from his temperance days, railroad men, territorial judges, even a U.S. Marshal who owes him favors. If we ran, it wouldn't just be bounty hunters after you. It would be the full weight of the law. Then we'll be smarter. Careful. No. The word came out firm. Final. I won't be responsible for your death. You need to leave at first light, alone. Get as far from here as possible. And leave you to this? He gestured at the shed. The storm, the house where her husband waited. Leave you to die a little more each day. That's my choice to make. What if I won't go without you? She met his eyes steadily. Then I'll turn you in myself. Better you hang than die trying to save someone who can't be saved. You don't mean that. Try me. But her voice shook, betraying her. They stood facing each other, the storm raging outside matching the tempest between them. Finally, Caleb sank back onto the blankets, exhaustion and pain overtaking his strength. You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met, he said wearily. And you're a fool for thinking I'm worth saving. She knelt beside him, checking his fever again. Still too warm. But thank you for trying. Grace, rest now, please. We'll talk more before dawn. He caught her hand one more time. Promise me something. What? If I leave, when I leave, promise you'll remember that you have choices, that staying isn't the only option. She squeezed his hand gently. I'll remember. But as she settled beside him, keeping watch through the long hours of the night, Grace knew the truth. Some prisons were harder to escape than others, and some chains were forged not of iron, but of shame and fear and the terrible weight of other people's sins. The storm raged on, and in the house on the hill, Elijah Morrison worked on his sermon about the wages of sin, never knowing that his perfect wife sat in a shed with a wanted man, wishing she had the courage to choose damnation over salvation. But courage, like freedom, was easier to dream about than to grasp, and as the hours ticked toward dawn, Grace felt the moment slipping away, taking with it any chance of a different life. Still, she held Caleb's hand as he drifted into fitful sleep, and allowed herself this one small rebellion, to imagine, just for these stolen hours, what it would be like to be brave enough to run. The sound of footsteps on the porch boards shot through Grace like lightning. Heavy, measured steps. Elijah's. She dozed off beside Caleb, his hand still clasped in hers, and now dawn was breaking gray through the cracks in the shed walls. Move, she hissed, shaking Caleb awake. His eyes snapped open, instantly alert despite the fever. The cellar, now! She helped him to his feet, both of them stumbling toward the corner where the root cellar entrance lay hidden beneath old feed sacks. Her fingers fumbled with the iron ring, pulling up the heavy wooden door to reveal the ladder descending into darkness. Grace, Elijah's voice carried across the yard. What are you doing out here at this hour? Go, she whispered urgently. Caleb hesitated, and she could see the protest forming. Please, for me. He descended quickly, despite his injury, and she dropped the door, kicking the feed sacks back into place. Her hands flew to her hair, trying to pin back the loose strands, to make herself presentable. The shed door opened just as she turned. Elijah stood silhouetted against the pale morning light, still in his nightshirt and robe. His pale eyes took in every detail, her disheveled appearance, the rumpled blankets in the corner, the lamp still burning low. I asked you a question. Wife, I couldn't sleep. The words came out breathless. The storm damaged some of the roof. I came to check if the wood was getting wet. He stepped into the shed, and she forced herself not to step back. His gaze swept the space methodically, pausing on the blankets. Since when do we keep bedding in the woodshed? For the cats, she said quickly. The barn cats. I thought, with the cold. We don't have barn cats. His voice was dangerously quiet. You know I don't approve of keeping animals. Her mind raced. Wild ones. Then they've been keeping the mice down. I thought. The slap came without warning, snapping her head to the side. Not hard enough to knock her down. Elijah was always careful about visible marks, but enough to make her ears ring. Do not lie to me. Each word was precisely enunciated. I can smell it in here. Whiskey, blood, man sweat. His hand gripped her chin, forcing her to look at him. Who was here? No one. The second slap was harder. The truth. Grace. Or shall I summon Sheriff Watson and let him question you? Her mind spun desperately. The sheriff would search everything, find Caleb, but if she admitted to helping a stranger, a drifter, she whispered. He was hurt. I gave him food and shelter from the storm, but he left hours ago. Elijah's grip on her chin tightened painfully. You brought a strange man into our property? Let him stay the night? He was injured, bleeding. I couldn't. Couldn't what? Remember your marriage vows? Your duty to your husband? He released her with a shove that sent her stumbling against the wall. Or perhaps you remembered other things. Other nights? Other men? That's not. Do you think I'm blind? Grace, think I don't know what you are? He advanced on her, and she pressed back against the rough boards. Daughter of a harlot, saved from the streets by my charity. I've spent 5 years trying to wash the stain from you, to make you worthy of God's grace. I've been a good wife, she said desperately. I've done everything you asked. Have you? His hand shot out, gripping her throat. Not squeezing, not yet, but the threat was clear. Then why does my wife reek of another man? Why do I find her alone with him in the dark? From beneath their feet came the slightest sound, a shifted board, quickly stilled. Elijah's head tilted, like a hawk spotting prey. What was that? Rats, Grace said quickly. The shed has rats. That's why I wanted the cats. His hand tightened, cutting off her words. You think me a fool, woman. The world began to gray at the edges. She clawed at his hand, but he was stronger than his aesthetic appearance suggested. Just as spots began to dance in her vision, he released her. She collapsed to her knees, gasping. There's someone down there, he said with terrible certainty. He kicked aside the feed sacks, revealing the cellar door. Your drifter didn't leave, did he? Elijah, please. Silence. He grabbed the iron ring, hauling the door open. You down there, come up slowly, hands where I can see them, or I'll have the sheriff smoke you out. For a long moment, nothing. Then Caleb's voice, steady despite everything. I'm coming up, no need for threats. He emerged slowly, favoring his wounded shoulder, hands raised, even injured and fevered. He moved with the controlled grace of a dangerous man. Elijah stepped back, producing a small pistol from his robe pocket. Of course he was armed, even for morning prayers. A wanted man, no doubt, Elijah said, studying Caleb's face. I've seen your type before. Gun hands, thieves, murderers fleeing justice. Just a man seeking shelter from the storm, Caleb replied calmly. Your wife showed Christian charity, no harm intended to anyone. Christian charity. Elijah laughed, an ugly sound. Is that what she told you? Did she mention she's the daughter of a prostitute? That such charity runs in her blood? Grace saw something shift in Caleb's eyes, a coldness settling over his features. Careful, Reverend, that's no way to speak about a lady. Lady? Elijah's voice rose. This is no lady. This is a woman I pulled from the gutter, tried to remake in God's image. But you can't wash the sin from blood, can you? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The only sin I see here, Caleb said quietly, is a man who uses God as an excuse to torment his wife. The pistol in Elijah's hand steadied. You dare lecture me on sin? You, who corrupted my wife, who turned her from her duty. I did nothing but accept help when I needed it. Caleb's gaze flicked to Grace, who was struggling to her feet. If you see corruption in kindness, maybe the problem isn't with her. Enough. Elijah's face had gone white with rage. Grace, go to the house. Lock yourself in our bedroom and pray for forgiveness. I'll deal with you after I've summoned the sheriff. No. The word surprised them all. Perhaps Grace most of all. She stepped forward, placing herself partially between the two men. I won't let you do this. You won't let me? Disbelief colored Elijah's tone. You forget yourself. Wife. No, she said, stronger now. For the first time in 5 years, I remember myself. Her hand moved to her pocket, where the weight of the kitchen knife pressed against her hip. This man saved my life once. I won't watch him hang for the crime of needing help. Saved your life. Elijah's eyes narrowed. When? How? More lies. Grace. She lifted her chin. Red Gulch. 5 years ago. 3 men tried to hurt me. He stopped them. Understanding dawned in Elijah's face, followed by something worse than rage: disgust. "So that's it. Not charity, but payment. You've been warming his bed, haven't you? Repaying him with the only currency a whore's daughter knows?" The words hit her like physical blows, each one finding its mark. But before she could respond, Caleb moved. Despite his injury, he was fast, faster than Elijah expected. His hand swept up, knocking the pistol aside just as it fired. The shot went wild, splintering wood near the roof. The two men grappled, but it was an uneven match. Caleb was wounded, fevered, weakened by blood loss. Elijah was fresh, driven by righteous fury. They crashed against the wall, sending tools clattering. "Stop!" Grace cried. But neither man heard her. Elijah managed to slam Caleb's wounded shoulder against a post, drawing a grunt of pain. The pistol had fallen somewhere in the struggle. As Caleb staggered, Elijah's hands found his throat. "I'll see you hang," the minister snarled. "But first, you'll watch what happens to whores who forget their place." Grace didn't remember drawing the knife. One moment she was watching in horror. The next, the blade was in her hand. As Elijah pressed his advantage, she acted on instinct older than thought. "Let him go," she said, pressing the knife point against Elijah's ribs. "Now, her husband froze, turning his head slowly to stare at her. "You wouldn't dare. I killed my mother's murderer," she lied, letting ice creep into her voice. "Cut his throat while he slept it off. They never found his body. Do you really want to test me? For the first time in their marriage?" She saw fear flicker in Elijah's eyes. He released Caleb slowly, stepping back. "You're damned," he said. "Both of you. When they catch you, and they will, you'll hang side by side." "Maybe," Grace said. "But we'll hang free." Caleb had found the dropped pistol. He checked it with practiced ease, then leveled it at Elijah. "Turn around. Reverend, hands behind your back." "You can't. I can do a lot of things, but killing an unarmed man isn't one of them." "Lucky for you." He glanced at Grace. "Rope?" She found coils of it hanging on the wall, used for bundling wood. Together, they bound Elijah hand and foot, gagging him with his own handkerchief. "The cellar," Caleb suggested. "Buy us some time." They lowered the furious minister into the root cellar, Elijah's muffled curses following them down. Grace looked down at her husband one last time, seeing him clearly, not as her savior, not as a man of God, but as what he'd always been, a small, cruel man who needed others' weakness to feel strong. "Goodbye, Elijah," she said quietly, and dropped the door. They worked quickly after that, Grace gathering what supplies she could: food, water. The money Elijah kept hidden in his study. Caleb saddled both horses, his own and Elijah's sturdy mare. "He'll work free eventually," Caleb warned as they prepared to leave. "Or someone will find him. We'll have a few hours head start, maybe less." "I know." Grace had changed into her darkest dress, pinned her hair severely back. From a distance, she might pass for a respectable widow traveling with her brother. "Where do we go?" "South first. Throw them off. Then west. I know people who can help. Places to hide." He studied her face. "You can still change your mind. Say I forced you, that you had no choice." She silenced him with a kiss, swift and fierce. "I've made my choice. For the first time in my life, I've made my own choice." They mounted up as the sun broke fully over the horizon, painting the wet world gold behind them. The church stood silent on its hill, its shadow long and dark. Grace looked back once, then turned her face toward the unknown horizon. "Ready?" Caleb asked. She thought of her mother, dying in an alley for refusing to be what men wanted. Of 5 years sleeping beside a man who saw her as something to be reformed rather than loved. Of all the small deaths she'd died trying to be worthy of a salvation that came with chains. "I've been ready all my life," she said. They rode out together as the town began to stir. Two souls bound by necessity, and something that might, given time and distance, grow into love. Behind them, muffled shouts began to rise from beneath the woodshed, but the wind carried them away. Grace Morrison died that morning. along with the preacher's perfect wife. But Grace Daniels, or whatever name she chose to wear, was finally, truly alive. The sun climbed higher, burning off the storm's remnants as Grace and Caleb rode hard across the prairie. Every hoofbeat took them farther from Redemption Creek, but Grace knew distance alone wouldn't save them. Not with Elijah's connections. Not with the story he'd spin, a virtuous minister betrayed by his wanton wife and the outlaw who'd corrupted her. They'd been riding for 3 hours when Caleb finally called a halt near a grove of cottonwoods. He swayed in the saddle, and Grace saw fresh blood seeping through his shirt. "We need to stop," she said, dismounting quickly. "Your wound can wait." But he let her help him down, leaning heavily against her. "We're too exposed here. There's a place about 10 miles south, an old trading post, abandoned now. We can rest there, plan our next move. 10 miles might as well be 100 if you bleed to death before we get there." She made him sit against a tree while she checked the damage. The morning's struggle had torn some of her careful stitching, and the ride hadn't helped. She worked quickly, using strips torn from her petticoat to bind it tighter. "You're getting good at this," Caleb said, trying for lightness despite the pain. "I've had practice now." She secured the final knot, though I'd prefer not to make a habit of it. He caught her hand as she pulled away. "Grace, we need to talk about what happens when they catch up. When, not if. I'm a realist. Elijah will have the whole territory looking for us by nightfall. My wanted posters already have me worth $1,000. Add kidnapping a minister's wife." He shook his head. "They'll send everyone. I wasn't kidnapped. You think that matters? Your word against his?" His thumb traced her knuckles. "I need you to promise me something. When they catch up, and they will, you tell them I forced you, that I threatened you, that you had no choice." "No." "Grace." "I said no." She pulled her hand free, standing abruptly. "We're in this together or not at all. I won't buy my freedom with your life. Stubborn woman." He muttered, but there was admiration in it. They reached the abandoned trading post as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. It was little more than a collection of rotting buildings, but the main structure still had most of its roof and walls. They led the horses inside, out of sight. Grace explored while Caleb rested, finding an old well with brackish but drinkable water, some preserved goods left behind, hardtack, beans, even a tin of peaches somehow overlooked. She brought their supplies inside and set about making the place as comfortable as possible. "Used to come here as a boy," Caleb said, watching her work. "Back when it was still operating, old Jim Bridger ran it. Had stories about the mountains that could make your hair stand on end." "What happened to it?" "Railroad came through 20 miles east. Towns sprung up around the depot, and places like this just died." He shifted, wincing. "Progress, they call it." Grace understood. How many small deaths had progress demanded? How many lives ground under the wheels of civilization's advance? As the sun began its descent, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her since morning. "Did you mean what you said? About Red Gulch?" "Every word." He met her gaze steadily. "I've carried you with me for 5 years. Grace, the girl with fire in her eyes who was worth saving, worth killing for. I'm not that girl anymore." "No," he agreed. "You're more stronger, tempered by surviving what would have broken others." He paused. "Do you regret it? Coming with me?" She considered the question honestly. In a single morning, she'd lost everything. Her home, her reputation, any claim to respectability. By now, Elijah would have been found. The story would be spreading like wildfire through Redemption Creek. The minister's wife, revealed as a harlot's daughter, run off with a wanted man. She'd never be able to show her face in any decent town again. "No," she said finally. "I regret the years I wasted trying to be something I'm not, but not this, never this." Night fell, and with it came the sound they'd been dreading. Hoofbeats in the distance. Many horses moving fast. Grace's hand found the pistol Caleb had taught her to use during their afternoon of waiting. "Could be anyone," she said, but even she didn't believe it. Caleb was already moving, checking sight lines, cataloging exits. "Take the horses out the back. Head for the ravine we passed. I'm not leaving you. Grace, please. I can hold them off. Give you time." "To do what? Run alone? Wait for them to hunt me down like an animal?" She checked the pistol's cylinder. Hands steady. "We stand together or fall together." The hoofbeats grew closer. Torchlight flickered through the gaps in the walls. A voice called out, "Sheriff Watson." Grace recognized. Elijah had wasted no time calling in his favors. "Hayes, Caleb Hayes, this is Sheriff Watson of Redemption Creek. I've got 10 men with me and more coming. Send Mrs. Morrison out, and we might can talk about this peaceable-like." Caleb and Grace exchanged glances. They both knew there would be no peaceful resolution, not with Elijah pulling the strings. "The lady's not interested in your hospitality, Sheriff." Caleb called back. "Best you turn around before someone gets hurt." "Can't do that. Son, got paper on you from 3 territories, and now kidnapping charges to boot. But it ain't too late for Mrs. Morrison. Her husband's a forgiving man. Says he'll take her back, no questions asked." Grace laughed, bitter and sharp. "Forgiving? Is that what he calls it?" She moved to a gap in the wall where she could see out. The sheriff sat his horse in the moonlight, flanked by deputies and townsmen. Good, respectable men who'd tip their hats to her on Sundays, who'd never looked deeper than her modest dress and downcast eyes. "Mrs. Morrison," the sheriff's voice gentled, patronizing. "I know you've been through an ordeal, but your husband's worried sick. Just come on out, and we'll get you home safe." "Sheriff Watson," she called back. "Did my husband mention the bruises he left on my throat this morning? Did he tell you how he speaks to me when no one's listening? Or does his version just have me as the whore's daughter who finally showed her true colors?" Silence greeted this. Then, "Now, ma'am, that's just the hysteria talking. This outlaw's filled your head with notions." A shot rang out, splintering wood near the sheriff's head. Not from Caleb. One of the deputies had gotten jumpy. "Hold your fire!" Watson shouted, but it was too late. The night exploded into chaos. Grace and Caleb fought with the desperation of the cornered, picking their shots, making each one count, but the numbers were against them. For every man they drove back, 2 more seemed to take his place. "The roof," Caleb said during a lull. "There's a way up. We can make it to the horses." A shot took him in the side, spinning him against the wall. Grace screamed, catching him as he fell. "Go!" he gasped, blood bubbling on his lips. "Please, Grace, go!" "Not without you." She pressed her hand against the wound, feeling the life pumping out between her fingers. "We go together. Remember?" More shots peppered the walls. Someone had brought oil. She could smell it, hear the splash of it against the old wood. They meant to burn them out. "Grace," Caleb's voice was weakening. "Listen to me. There's a place, Colorado, town called Haven. My sister runs a boarding house there. Tell her I said to help you. Start over. Be free. Stop talking like you're dying." He managed to smile. "Always were. Stubborn." The first flames began to lick at the walls. Smoke filled the air, acrid and choking. Outside, Sheriff Watson was shouting for them to surrender, but Grace barely heard him. All her focus was on Caleb, on the light fading from those amber eyes. "I love you," she said, the words torn from her heart. "I think I've loved you since that night in Red Gulch." "Grace!" His hand found her face, trembling. "Worth it, all of it, worth it for this." His hand fell, his chest stilled, and Grace Morrison felt something break inside her, sharp and final as shattered glass. The flames rose higher, and through the smoke, she heard Elijah's voice. He'd come to watch his triumph, to see his property returned or destroyed. It didn't matter which, as long as he won. Grace looked at Caleb's still face, at the future they'd never have, the freedom they'd tasted for one brief day. Then she looked at the gun in her hand, at the flames consuming their shelter, at the men outside waiting to drag her back to a living death. She told Caleb she'd made her choice. Now it was time to prove it. Standing slowly, Grace walked to the doorway. She could see them clearly. Watson, his deputies, Elijah standing behind them all like a righteous puppeteer. They saw her too, saw the gun, saw the resolution in her face. "Grace," Elijah called, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority. "Put down the weapon. Come home. All is forgiven." "Forgiven?" She laughed, wild and free. "I don't want your forgiveness, Elijah. I don't want your God or your mercy or your cage disguised as salvation. You're not thinking clearly. For the first time in 5 years, I'm thinking perfectly clearly." She raised the gun. Not at them, but at the oil-soaked beam above her head. One shot would bring the whole burning structure down. "You want to know what I choose? I choose freedom, even if it's only in death." "Grace, no!" But it wasn't Elijah's voice. It was another woman's, pushing through the crowd. Agnes Turner, the blacksmith's wife, who'd always been kind to her. "Please, dear, it doesn't have to end like this." Grace looked at her, at the one person in Redemption Creek who'd shown her genuine friendship. "Yes, it does. Some chains can only be broken one way." She saw the moment they understood. Saw Watson raising his rifle. Saw Elijah's face contort with rage at being denied his property. But she was faster. Had always been faster than they gave her credit for. The shot echoed across the prairie. The beam exploded in sparks and flame, and as the roof began its inexorable collapse, Grace dropped to her knees beside Caleb, gathering him into her arms. "Together," she whispered against his still lips. "Just like we promised." The last thing she saw before the burning timber fell was the stars through the smoke, bright and cold and free, looking down on two souls who'd chosen their own end rather than live in chains. The shot never came. Grace's finger froze on the trigger as a new voice rang out across the night, deep, commanding, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Stand down, all of you, stand down now." Through the smoke and flames, a rider emerged from the darkness. He wore the star of a U.S. Marshal, and even in the chaotic firelight, Grace could see the hard lines of a face carved by years of frontier justice. Behind him rode 6 more men, all armed, all wearing the unmistakable bearing of federal lawmen. "Marshal Garrett," Sheriff Watson stammered. "We weren't expecting—" "Clearly." The marshal dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene, the burning building. Grace standing in the doorway with a gun. The mob of townsmen. "Someone want to explain why you're about to burn 2 people alive?" Elijah pushed forward. "Marshal, I'm Reverend Morrison. That woman is my wife, and she's been kidnapped by the outlaw Caleb Hayes." "Reverend Morrison?" Garrett's voice was flat. "The same Reverend Morrison who's been under investigation for embezzling territorial funds meant for Indian relief?" The color drained from Elijah's face. "I don't know what you're talking about. Save it." Garrett turned to his men. "Get water on that fire, now." Then, to Grace. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put the gun down and step outside, slowly." Grace looked down at Caleb's still form, then back at the marshal. "He's dead. They killed him." "Maybe not, but he will be if we don't get him out of there." "Your choice, ma'am." Something in his tone, professional but not unkind, made her lower the weapon. She stumbled from the burning building as the marshal's men rushed past her with water from the well. 2 of them dragged Caleb out, and to her shock, one immediately began checking for signs of life. "Still breathing," he called, "but barely. Need a doctor fast." Grace tried to go to him, but strong hands held her back, not roughly, just firmly. Marshal Garrett stood before her, studying her face in the firelight. "You're not what I expected, Mrs. Morrison." "I'm not Mrs. Morrison." The words came out fierce. "Not anymore." "No? Then who are you?" She met his gaze steadily. Just a woman who made a choice. Behind them, Elijah was growing agitated. "Marshal, this is a matter for local law. That man is wanted in 3 territories, which makes him my business, not yours." Garrett didn't even turn around. "As for Miss, well, I don't see any evidence of kidnapping here." "She's my wife. She took money from my house, helped a criminal escape. Now, Garrett did turn, and his expression made Elijah step back. Reverend, you've got bigger problems than a runaway wife. We've been tracking missing territorial funds for 6 months. Amazing how they all seem to lead back to your charity operations. That's absurd. I'm a man of God, who's been stealing from the very people you claim to help. Garrett nodded to one of his deputies. Take the Reverend into custody. We'll sort this out back in Cheyenne. You can't. Elijah's composure finally cracked. Do you know who I am? The connections I have? I know exactly who you are. The marshal's voice was cold as winter iron. And those connections are precisely why Washington sent me instead of leaving this to local law. As the deputies moved to arrest him, Elijah's mask finally fell completely, his face contorted with rage as he looked at Grace. You harlot! You've destroyed everything, just like your mother, born in sin, living in sin. You'll die in... The marshal's fist connected with Elijah's jaw, dropping him mid-sentence. That's enough. Deputy Carter, gag him if he opens his mouth again. Sheriff Watson stood uncertain, his posse milling about in confusion. Marshal, what about Hayes? He still wanted... I'll handle Hayes. Garrett pulled a folded paper from his coat. What you might not know. Sheriff, is that 2 weeks ago? A judge in Denver reviewed his case. Turns out Jake Thornton, the man Hayes allegedly murdered, is alive and well in San Francisco. Has been for 2 years. Grace's heart stopped. What? Seems young Thornton decided he'd rather fake his death and run off with his father's money than face his debts. His father knew but kept the bounty active anyway. Easier to blame a convenient scapegoat than admit his son was a thief. Then Caleb is a free man. Soon as I get this mess sorted out. The marshal looked at where the deputies were working over Caleb's still form. If he lives. The next hours passed in a blur. They commandeered wagons from town, loading Caleb carefully for transport. Grace refused to leave his side, and Marshal Garrett didn't force the issue. Elijah, bound and under guard, was placed in a separate wagon. As dawn broke across the prairie, they made a strange procession back toward Redemption Creek. Grace held Caleb's hand, willing him to keep breathing, whispering prayers to a God she'd never quite believed in before. He stirred just as they reached the edge of town. His eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on her face. Grace? His voice was barely a whisper. You're alive? So are you. Tears ran freely down her face. Against all odds, we both are. Thought I dreamed it. You saying, that I love you? She squeezed his hand. Not a dream, and I'll say it as many times as you need to hear it. The town was in uproar as they arrived. Word had already spread. Their minister arrested. His wife revealed as choosing to leave, the wanted man who wasn't actually wanted. Some faces showed shock, others a kind of grim satisfaction. Apparently, Elijah hadn't been as universally beloved as he'd believed. The doctor, a competent man named Hartley, took over Caleb's care immediately. While he worked, Marshal Garrett drew Grace aside. I need to ask you some questions about your husband's activities, but first, he handed her an envelope. This came through the telegraph office yesterday, addressed to Caleb Hayes, care of general delivery. Seems someone knew he might be in the area. Grace opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a brief message. Brother, heard you might be needing that fresh start we talked about. Room's ready whenever you are. Love, Margaret. Colorado? She whispered. He told me about his sister in Colorado. Garrett nodded. Good place for new beginnings. I hear, once this mess is settled, of course. He paused. You'll need to testify about what you know of your husband's dealings. But after that, well, far as I'm concerned, you're a free woman. Where you go and who you go with is your business. A week passed. Caleb's recovery was slow but steady, the doctor marveling at his constitution. Grace rarely left his side, helping tend his wounds, reading to him, simply being present as he fought his way back to health. She testified as promised, revealing what she knew of Elijah's financial dealings, more than she'd realized. Once she started putting pieces together, The church funds that never quite made it to their intended recipients. The charity missions that existed only on paper. The ledgers he thought she was too stupid to understand. The good wives of Redemption Creek didn't know what to do with her. Some cut her dead in the street. Others, like Agnes Turner, offered quiet support. Always thought there was something cold about that man. Agnes confided. Way he looked at you sometimes, like you were property instead of a person. On the 8th day, Caleb was strong enough to sit up, then stand, then take a few careful steps. Marshal Garrett had long since departed with his prisoner, leaving behind official pardons for Caleb and a curt message that they should try to stay out of trouble. Easier said than done, Caleb muttered, reading it. Then he looked at Grace, his expression growing serious. We need to talk about what comes next. Colorado, she said simply. Your sister's place. If the offer stands. You know it does. He caught her hand. But Grace, are you sure? It won't be easy. People talk, word spreads. The scandal will follow us wherever we go. She finished for him. I know, but at least we'll be facing it together. As ourselves, not as people pretending to be something we're not. He studied her face. No regrets. Only one. She moved closer, careful of his healing wounds. That it took so long to find you again. They left Redemption Creek on a crisp October morning, 2 weeks after that fateful night in the storm. Grace wore a simple traveling dress, not black like a widow, not gray like a minister's wife, but deep blue like the sky before dawn. Caleb rode carefully, still favoring his side, but his eyes were clear and focused on the horizon. Some townspeople came to see them off. Agnes Turner pressed a basket of food into Grace's hands. Doc Hartley checked Caleb's bandages one last time. Even Sheriff Watson tipped his hat, looking somewhat sheepish about the whole affair. As they rode out, Grace turned for one last look at the church on the hill. Someone had already removed the cross. Turned out Elijah had taken loans against the building itself, and creditors were closing in. Soon it would be just another empty building, a monument to false piety and hidden cruelty. Any second thoughts? Caleb asked, watching her. No. She faced forward, toward the mountains rising in the distance. That's not my life anymore. Maybe it never really was. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the vast prairie stretching before them. Then Caleb spoke again, his voice thoughtful. You know, I've been running for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like to ride towards something instead of away. Grace smiled, the first truly free smile she'd worn in years. Well, we've got time to remember. All the time in the world. Together. And as the sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night, Grace Daniels, no longer Morrison, finally herself again, rode toward her new life with the man who'd saved her twice, once from violence in a mining camp, and once from the slower death of a loveless marriage. Behind them, Redemption Creek grew smaller and smaller, until it was just another speck on the vast canvas of the frontier. Ahead lay Colorado, and Haven, and the chance to build something real from the ashes of their past. It wouldn't be easy. But then, Grace reflected, the best things in life rarely were. And as Caleb reached over to take her hand, she knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever came next, they would face it as they'd promised, together. The preacher's wife was gone. In her place rode a woman who'd hidden a revolver and invited a wanted man to stay until dawn, and in doing so, had finally found her way home. The journey to Colorado took 12 days. 12 days of open sky and endless horizon, of camping under stars and waking to frost on their bedrolls. Grace discovered muscles she didn't know she had, learned to read weather in cloud formations, to find water by following game trails. Each mile took them farther from Redemption Creek and deeper into a future neither quite dared name yet. Caleb grew stronger with each passing day, though he still tired easily. They stopped often, making camp early, taking time he might once have begrudged. But there was no pursuit now, no bounty hunters dogging their trail. For the first time in years, Caleb Hayes could afford to move slowly, "Tell me about your sister," Grace said one evening as they sat by their small fire. They'd made camp in a grove of aspens, their golden leaves whispering secrets in the breeze. "Margaret's 5 years older than me, practically raised me after Mother died." Caleb poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "She married young. Good man named Thomas Fletcher. They went west in '74, settled in Haven when it was barely more than a mining camp. And her husband died 3 winters back, cave-in at the mine." His voice carried old sorrow. "Margaret could have remarried, had offers, but she used the insurance money to open a boarding house instead. Said she'd had enough of depending on men." Grace understood that sentiment all too well. What will she think of me?" Caleb looked at her across the fire. "She'll think I'm the luckiest man alive." But Grace heard what he didn't say. The questions Margaret would have, the explanations they'd need to give. A woman who ran from her minister husband, who chose scandal over safety. What kind of sister would welcome that? They reached Haven on a Thursday afternoon, when the sun was painting the mountains purple and gold. The town sprawled in a valley, bigger than Grace had expected. Proper streets, a bank, several churches, even an opera house. Mining money had transformed it from rough camp to respectable town. The boarding house sat on Elm Street, a neat 2-story building with green shutters and a sign reading, "Fletcher's Rest, clean beds, hot meals, fair prices." Grace's stomach nodded as Caleb helped her dismount. "It'll be fine," he said, but she heard the nervousness in his voice too. The door opened before they could knock. The woman who emerged was unmistakably Caleb's sister. Same dark hair, same amber eyes, though hers were creased with laugh lines. She took one look at her brother and pulled him into a fierce embrace. "You fool," she said, voice thick with tears. "You absolute fool. I thought you were dead." "Nearly was." He hugged her back, careful of his still tender wounds. "Margaret, I want you to meet. I know who she is." Margaret pulled back, studying Grace with those penetrating eyes. "The minister's wife from Wyoming. News travels, even to Haven." Grace lifted her chin, waiting for judgment. But Margaret surprised her. "Good," she said firmly. "About time my brother found a woman with backbone. Come inside, both of you. You look dead on your feet." The boarding house was warm and welcoming, smelling of fresh bread and coffee. Margaret bustled them into her private parlor, settling Caleb in the best chair, pressing tea into Grace's hands. "Now," she said, fixing them both with a stern look, "I want the truth, not the gossip, not the scandal sheet version. What really happened?" So they told her. Everything. From Red Gulch to Elijah's arrest. From the fire to Marshal Garrett's intervention. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression giving nothing away. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, "That bastard. Pardon my language, but calling himself a man of God while—" She shook her head. "Grace, honey, I'm sorry for what you've been through." Grace blinked back tears. You're not scandalized?" "Scandalized?" Margaret snorted. "I'm scandalized that it took my brother 5 years to find you again. I'm scandalized that men like your husband can hide behind a collar and respectability while tormenting their wives. But a woman choosing freedom over misery? Nothing scandalous about that." The relief was overwhelming. Grace had been braced for condemnation, for careful politeness, hiding disgust. Instead, she found acceptance. "Now," Margaret continued briskly, "we need to be practical. The talk will die down eventually. Haven's got its share of folks running from something, and most people mind their own business. But you'll need a story, something simple." "We thought," Caleb began, but Margaret cut him off. "Your widow, Grace. Married young. Husband died of fever. You came west to start over. Met my brother on the trail. Love at second sight." She smiled at their expressions. "What? It's close enough to true, and easier than explaining the whole mess. But if someone recognizes—" "They won't. You're not the first woman to reinvent herself out here, and you won't be the last." Margaret's expression softened. "The frontier's good for that, giving people second chances." They stayed at the boarding house while Caleb finished healing and they figured out their next steps. Grace helped Margaret with cooking and cleaning, earning her keep, learning the rhythms of this new life. The other boarders, miners, traveling salesmen, a school teacher saving for her own house, accepted her with minimal questions. But at night, when the house was quiet, Grace would lie in her narrow bed and wonder what came next. She and Caleb had barely touched since arriving, careful of propriety under his sister's roof. The desperate intimacy of their escape seemed like a dream now, something that couldn't survive in daylight. Then came the night when she couldn't sleep, haunted by nightmares of Elijah breaking free, of fires and judgment. She slipped downstairs to the kitchen, thinking to make tea, and found Caleb there before her. Couldn't sleep either. He looked haggard in the lamplight. "Dreams," she admitted. He nodded, understanding. "Gets better. The looking over your shoulder, the jumping at shadows. Takes time, but it fades." They sat together at the kitchen table, not speaking, just being present. Finally, Grace gathered her courage. "Caleb, what are we to each other now?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "What do you want us to be?" "I don't know." The honesty hurt. "Everything happened so fast. One day I was trapped in a marriage I hated. The next I was declaring my love to a dying man. And now—" She gestured helplessly. "Now we have time," he finished. "Time to figure it out without guns and fire and desperation driving us." Is that what it was? Desperation? No. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "At least, not on my part. I meant what I said. Grace, I've carried you with me for 5 years, but I know that's not the same as knowing someone day to day, building a real life together. So what do? We take it slow, court proper-like, as much as two people with our history can. Let you decide if what you feel is real or just gratitude for getting you out of a bad situation." Grace turned her hand palm up, lacing their fingers together. "And if it's real, then we build something together. A life, a home, maybe even a family someday." His thumb traced her knuckles. "But only if it's what you want. You've had enough of men making decisions for you. What if people talk? Let them. We've faced worse than gossip." Margaret found them there as dawn broke, still holding hands across the table. She took in the scene with one raised eyebrow. "About time," was all she said, before bustling about making breakfast. As autumn deepened toward winter, Grace and Caleb began their careful courtship. He'd recovered enough to take work at the local stable, good with horses and needing the income. Grace continued helping Margaret, but also began taking in sewing, a skill from her mother she'd never thought would prove useful. They took walks in the evening, bundled against the mountain cold. He brought her small gifts, a blue ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry, once a handful of late wildflowers that made her cry for their unexpected beauty. She cooked his favorite meals, mended his shirts, read to him from the newspaper in Margaret's parlor. It was ordinary, quiet, nothing like the passion that had driven them together. And yet Grace found herself treasuring each small moment, each casual touch, each shared smile. This was what she'd never had with Elijah, the simple pleasure of choosing to be with someone, of building affection day by day. The first snow came early, blanketing Haven in pristine white. Grace stood at the boarding house window, watching it fall. When Caleb came to stand beside her, "Penny, for your thoughts? Just thinking how different it all is. Last winter, I dreaded the snow. It meant being trapped inside with Elijah, no escape from his moods and sermons." She turned to look at him. "Now it just seems beautiful. You're beautiful," he said softly. "Have I told you that today?" "Only twice. Shameful neglect." He cupped her face gently. "Grace, I need to ask you something." Her heart stuttered. "Yes?" "Margaret's been patient, but we can't live on her charity forever. I've saved enough to rent a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but solid. Needs work, but I'm handy enough." He took a breath. "I guess what I'm asking is, would you consider making it our house?" "Caleb Hayes. Is that a proposal?" The worst one in history. Probably. He smiled ruefully. But yes, I'm asking if you'll marry me. Grace. Not because you need saving, not because we're running from something, but because I can't imagine facing whatever comes next without you. Grace looked at this man who'd saved her, who'd nearly died for her, who'd given her the space to choose him freely. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the world into something clean and new. Yes, she said simply. He kissed her then, there in the window where anyone could see, and Grace didn't care. Let them see. Let them know that the minister's wife who'd hidden a revolver had found something worth more than respectability. They were married 2 weeks later, in Margaret's parlor with only a handful of witnesses. Grace wore her blue traveling dress and carried late roses from Margaret's garden. Caleb had trimmed his beard and bought a new shirt for the occasion. The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional, but the promises behind them were anything but, as the justice of the peace pronounced them husband and wife. Grace thought of another wedding, another life. Then she let it go. Like smoke on the wind. That woman was gone, and in her place stood Grace Hayes, chosen freely, loved truly, ready for whatever came next. The little house on Oak Street waited for them, needing paint and repairs but full of possibility. And as Caleb carried her over the threshold, Grace laughed, not the bitter laugh of her old life, but something bright and clear as mountain air. They were home, not just in Haven, not just in the house, but in each other. Two souls who'd found their way through violence and betrayal to this quiet moment, this simple joy. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering their footprints, hiding their trail. But Grace and Caleb didn't need to run anymore. They'd found what they were looking for, what they hadn't even known they were seeking until that night of storms and choices. They'd found their way to each other. And that, Grace thought as she pulled her husband close, was worth every hard mile traveled to get here. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it arrived, it transformed Haven into a paradise of wildflowers and rushing streams. Grace stood in the garden behind their little house on Oak Street, her hands deep in the rich soil, planting seeds that would bloom by summer. 6 months had passed since their wedding. 6 months of building a life stitch by stitch, board by board, day by ordinary day. Potatoes are coming in nice, Caleb observed from the porch, where he was mending a harness. His work at the stable had expanded. Now he was training horses for the mining companies. Good, steady work that kept them comfortable. Everything grows well here, Grace replied, brushing dirt from her hands. The soil's forgiving. Like the people, she thought but didn't say. Haven had accepted them more easily than she'd dared hope. Oh, there'd been whispers at first. There always were when strangers arrived with careful stories. But Grace Hayes, the seamstress, who charged fair prices and did excellent work, who helped Margaret Fletcher at the boarding house, who sang in the church choir with a voice clear as mountain water. She was easier to accept than Grace Morrison, the minister's runaway wife. Letter came, Caleb said, producing an envelope from his pocket. From Redemption Creek. Grace's hands stilled. They'd had a few letters over the months, Agnes Turner writing about town gossip, Doc Hartley updating them on various ailments and scandals. But each one made her heart race, waiting for news that Elijah had somehow escaped justice. She opened it with trembling fingers, then laughed in relief. It's from Agnes. She says... Grace scanned the lines. Oh my, Elijah was convicted. 5 years in territorial prison for embezzlement and fraud. The church has been sold to pay his debts, and the new minister is a lovely young man with an equally lovely wife who actually smiles. 5 years. Caleb set aside his work, coming to stand beside her. Not enough for what he did to you, but something. It's enough, Grace said softly. He's locked up, and I'm free. That's justice enough for me. Caleb wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head. Any regrets? It had become their ritual, this question, his way of making sure she was happy, that she'd chosen freely. Her answer was always the same. Only that it took so long to find you. But this time, she turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes bright with unshed tears. Actually, I do have one new regret. Concern flickered across his face. What's wrong? I regret that I'll have to let out all my dresses soon. It seems we're going to need that extra bedroom after all. It took him a moment to understand. Then his face transformed with wonder. Grace, are you saying? By my count, come autumn you'll be a father. Caleb Hayes. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around right there in the garden, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, his hands went immediately to her still flat stomach, reverently gentle. A baby, he breathed. Our baby. Ours, she confirmed. Born free, into a home built on love instead of fear. The months that followed were the happiest Grace had ever known. Her body changed, life quickening within her, and with it came a deep sense of rightness. This was what she'd been meant for, not the stilted performance of the minister's wife, but this real life with its gardens and horses, its mending and cooking, its quiet evenings by the fire with Caleb reading aloud while she sewed tiny clothes. Margaret fussed over her like a mother hen, bringing remedies for morning sickness, advice for everything from swollen ankles to choosing names. The women of Haven, led by the doctor's wife, organized a quilting bee that produced enough blankets for 3 babies. Even crusty old Samuel Barnes from the general store slipped her peppermint sticks for the little one whenever she came in. I was thinking, Grace said one evening as summer gave way to fall, about names. Caleb looked up from the cradle he was building, wood shavings in his hair. What kind of names? If it's a boy, William, maybe? After your father? He smiled. I'd like that. And if it's a girl? Grace was quiet for a moment. Faith, she said finally. Not for religion, but for believing things can be better. For taking leaps in the dark and trusting someone will catch you. Faith Hayes. Caleb tested the name. I like it, though with our luck, she'll probably be as stubborn as her mother, and as reckless as her father. Grace retorted, then gasped as the baby kicked. Oh, feel! Caleb abandoned the cradle immediately, kneeling beside her chair to place his hands on her belly. His face lit up as he felt the movement. Strong, he said, already fighting to get out and see the world, or fighting to stay safe inside a little longer, Grace suggested. Not everyone's in such a hurry to face life's storms. No, Caleb agreed, looking up at her. But the ones who do, who face them head on, they're the ones who change things. Labor came with the first snow of October, as if the baby knew it was time to arrive before winter locked them in. Margaret took charge, having delivered dozens of babies over the years, with the doctor's wife assisting. Caleb paced outside like every expectant father since time began, jumping at every sound. It was a long labor, but not a complicated one, as dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks rose and gold. Faith Elizabeth Hayes announced her arrival with a cry that could have woken the whole valley. A girl, Margaret announced, placing the wrapped bundle in Grace's exhausted arms, perfect as a sunrise and twice as loud. Grace looked down at her daughter, their daughter, and felt her heart expand beyond what she'd thought possible. Dark hair like Caleb's, the shape of Grace's eyes, and an expression of fierce determination that was entirely her own. Let her father in before he wears a groove in my porch, Margaret said with fond exasperation. Caleb burst through the door, wild-eyed with worry that transformed instantly to awe when he saw them. He approached slowly, as if afraid he might break the spell. Faith, Grace said softly, meet your papa. Caleb touched the baby's cheek with one trembling finger. Faith immediately grabbed it in her tiny fist, holding on with surprising strength. She's got your grip, he said, voice rough with emotion. Lord help us all. They settled into life as a family of 3 with the same determination that had brought them together. Faith was indeed as stubborn as her mother and as restless as her father. But she was also quick to smile, eager to explore, fearless in that way of children who've only known love. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Grace would remember another life. Cramped rooms that smelled of judgment. Nights spent counting ceiling boards. The weight of being always watched. Always found wanting. But those memories faded more each day. Like old photographs left too long in the sun. One evening, as spring came round again, Grace sat on the porch watching Caleb work with a new colt in the paddock. Faith, now crawling everywhere, was corralled beside her in a wooden pen Caleb had built, babbling happily at a cloth doll Margaret had made. "Content?" Caleb called over, grinning as the colt finally accepted the lead. Grace looked at her daughter, at her husband, at the mountains standing eternal guard around their valley. She thought of all the paths that had led here, the violence and fear, the desperate choices, the night she'd hidden a revolver and invited a wanted man to stay until dawn. Every hard mile had been worth it for this moment, this life, this freedom to simply be, "Yes," she called back, "completely content." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Grace lifted Faith into her arms. The baby reached for her father, babbling excitedly, and Caleb jogged over to sweep them both into his embrace. "What are you thinking?" he asked, seeing something in her expression. "Just that some storms bring destruction," Grace said, "but others wash the world clean, make room for new growth." "Speaking of growth," Caleb said, his hand moving to her stomach with a questioning look. Grace smiled, covering his hand with hers. "I was going to tell you tonight. Faith is going to be a big sister." He kissed her then, right there in the yard with the chickens pecking around their feet and their daughter giggling between them. It wasn't the stuff of grand romance novels. It was better. It was real. As they went inside for supper, Grace paused at the threshold, looking back at the valley spread below. Somewhere out there, beyond the mountains, lay Redemption Creek in the shadow of who she'd been. But that woman, the preacher's wife who died inside a little more each day, felt like a stranger now, a character from someone else's story. This was her story, her choice, her life. And as Caleb called her to table, and Faith reached chubby arms toward her mama, Grace knew with bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Some women were born to be tamed, to live quietly within the lines others drew for them. But Grace Hayes, née Daniels, who'd once been Morrison, had been born for wider skies. She'd hidden a revolver and invited a wanted man to stay until dawn, and in doing so, had saved not just his life, but her own. The preacher's wife was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd chosen love over safety, freedom over respectability, truth over comfortable lies. A woman who knew that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was also the most necessary, to reach for happiness with both hands and refuse to let go. As night fell over Haven and the first stars appeared above the mountains, Grace Hayes tucked her daughter into her cradle, kissed her husband good night, and thanked whatever power had brought them all safely home. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, as tomorrows always did. But tonight, in their little house on Oak Street, all was well. And that, she thought as sleep claimed her, was miracle enough for anyone. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West Campfire. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this story, whether you're driving through the mountains, sitting by your own fireside, or perhaps stealing a moment of peace in your busy day. Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts in the comments. Your stories about where and how you listen help build our community of Western tale enthusiasts. Until next time, keep riding toward your own horizons.